They said Daniel Frost had numbers in his blood and ice in his veins. He was a frontier banker who'd built the only successful financial institution in 3 territories, and rumor had it he could spot fraud from across a crowded room just by watching how a man held his ledger. Every woman who tried to work in his bank had been dismissed within days. He demanded perfection and had no patience for incompetence. They thought a man that exacting could never see value in someone who couldn't meet basic standards. They were wrong. They didn't know that sometimes genius comes without the wrapper society expects, and that the inability to read doesn't mean the inability to see patterns invisible to educated eyes. This is the true story of how a woman who couldn't read a single word solved a theft that educated bankers couldn't crack, and how a perfectionist learned that intelligence has nothing to do with literacy and everything to do with how your mind finds truth. Silver Ridge, Colorado Territory. September 1887. The bank was being robbed, and Daniel Frost couldn't prove it. He stood in his office overlooking the main floor of Frost & Company Bank, staring at ledgers that should balance but didn't. $3,000 had disappeared over 6 months, not in one dramatic heist but in tiny amounts, expertly hidden across dozens of accounts. Someone on his staff was stealing, and Daniel's perfect system, his foolproof procedures, his educated expertise had all failed to catch them. He was 38 years old. He'd built this bank from nothing after the silver boom, had survived 3 financial panics, had never lost a depositor's money to bad investments or poor management. He prided himself on running the most accurate, most trustworthy financial operation in Colorado Territory. His reputation was built on perfection. And now someone was making him look like a fool. His head clerk, Richard Morrison, knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a liberty Daniel allowed only his most trusted employee. Morrison had been with him for 5 years, was educated at a business college in St. Louis, knew banking procedures as well as Daniel did. "Sir, the new applicant is here," Morrison said. "The one for the filing position." "Send her away," Daniel said without looking up from the frustrating ledgers. "I'm not hiring today. You posted the position last week." She traveled from Denver specifically for this interview. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples where a headache was building. "Fine. 5 minutes. But Morrison, give her the standards test first. If she can't pass basic literacy and arithmetic, don't waste my time with the interview." Morrison nodded and left. Daniel returned to the ledgers, trying once more to find the pattern in the missing money. It was there, he could feel it, the way a mathematician could sense an elegant proof just out of reach. But every time he thought he saw it, the pattern dissolved into noise. 20 minutes later, Morrison returned. His face was troubled. "Well?" Daniel asked, impatient. "She failed the literacy test. Completely. Couldn't read a single word." "Then why are you still here?" "Dismiss her and—" "Sir." Morrison's interruption was rare enough to make Daniel look up. "She got every arithmetic problem correct, including the complex compound interest calculations I use to weed out applicants who lie about their mathematical skills. Problems that take most candidates 20 minutes with paper and pencil, she solved them in her head in under a minute. While I was still explaining the third problem, she'd already calculated the answer to 5 decimal places." Daniel felt his irritation shift to curiosity. "How is that possible if she can't read the problems?" "I had to read them to her." "But sir, she didn't just calculate, she explained the underlying mathematical principles. She told me why the calculations worked the way they did. She saw patterns I'd never noticed in problems I've been using for 3 years." Despite his frustration with the embezzlement, despite his headache, despite everything, Daniel felt genuine curiosity stir. "Bring her in." The woman who entered was about 26, wearing a simple but clean traveling dress in dark gray. She was plain-featured, brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, no jewelry, no attempts at beauty or fashion. Her posture spoke of someone used to being overlooked, dismissed, considered less than. But her eyes were extraordinary, sharp, intelligent, constantly moving and assessing everything in the room with rapid precision. "Miss?" Daniel prompted. "Catherine Shaw," she said. Her voice was educated, confident, a stark contrast to her plain appearance and the fact that she apparently couldn't read. "I know I failed the reading test. Before you dismiss me, I'd like to explain." "I'm listening." "I can't read," Catherine said directly, meeting his eyes without shame or apology. "Never could. My brain doesn't process letters the way other people's do. They swim and flip and refuse to stay still or make sense. Teachers tried for years. My parents paid for special tutoring. I tried desperately to learn because I knew illiteracy would limit every opportunity I'd ever have. But I failed at every attempt. Letters simply don't mean anything to my brain. Then why apply for a position that requires extensive documentation and file management? Because I can do the work. Just not the way you expect." Catherine pulled a small notebook from her bag. The pages were covered in symbols Daniel didn't recognize, shapes, colors, marks that looked like a code or perhaps a different language entirely. "This is my system. I've developed ways to organize, categorize, and track information without written words. Shapes represent different types of documents. Colors indicate priority or status. Position on the page shows relationships between items. I can remember hundreds of these patterns, cross-reference them instantly, and find connections between them that linear text-based systems miss." Daniel examined the strange notebook, fascinated despite his skepticism. "And you can do arithmetic?" "I can see patterns in numbers. Mathematics isn't about reading, it's about relationships, ratios, structure. Numbers form patterns in my mind like music. I don't need to read musical notation to hear a symphony. I don't need to read numbers to understand their relationships and calculate their interactions. That's an interesting talent, Miss Shaw, but a bank requires literacy. I need someone who can read contracts, file documents alphabetically, understand written correspondence, transcribe." "I understand you're being robbed," Catherine interrupted. Daniel froze. "Excuse me? I've been sitting in your waiting room for 40 minutes. I watched 6 transactions at the teller windows. Watched how your clerks handle money and paperwork. Watched the flow of work through your bank. And I saw the pattern. Someone is stealing from you, and they're very good at hiding it in your written ledgers. But they can't hide it from someone who reads systems instead of words. How could you possibly?" The way your head clerk's hands trembled slightly when handling certain account books. The way one of your tellers paused a fraction too long before completing a deposit, glancing toward your office to see if you were watching. The way anxiety moves through your staff like a current, they know something is wrong but don't know what or who. I can't read your ledgers, but I can read people and behavioral patterns. And something in your bank doesn't add up." Daniel stared at her. She'd identified his exact problem, the problem he'd been struggling with for months, in 40 minutes of observation from a waiting room. "Can you find the thief?" he asked. "Hire me for 2 weeks. If I can't solve your theft problem by then, you owe me nothing. If I do solve it, you pay me fairly and consider keeping me on staff." "Miss Shaw, that's impossible. You can't read the ledgers." "I don't need to read them," Catherine said firmly. "I need to see them. To watch patterns in how they're handled, who gets nervous when, who avoids which books, who touches them too much or not enough. To observe behavior, timing, relationships. Your ledgers tell you what happened. Behavior tells you who did it. Give me 2 weeks." Against every instinct, against all his training in hiring procedures and verification of credentials, against his better judgment, Daniel Frost agreed. Catherine started work the next morning, arriving precisely 15 minutes before the bank opened, early enough to observe the opening routines but not so early as to seem overeager or suspicious. Daniel assigned her to general filing and observation, a position where her illiteracy would be least problematic while still giving her access to the systems she needed to study. He also privately instructed Morrison to watch her closely and report any suspicious behavior or incompetence. The last thing Daniel needed was to hire a thief while trying to catch a thief, or to employ someone whose disability made her genuinely incapable of the work. Catherine spent her first morning simply watching. She positioned herself at a desk in the corner of the main banking hall where she had clear sightlines to all 4 teller windows, Morrison's head clerk station, the vault door, and Daniel's office on the 2nd floor. She sat perfectly still for 3 hours, her eyes tracking every movement, her hands occasionally making quick notes in her symbol system that no one else could read. The staff found it unnerving. By mid-morning, one of the tellers, a young man named James Porter, had complained to Morrison about that woman just staring at everyone. Morrison had relayed the complaint to Daniel, who'd responded, "Let her watch. That's what I hired her to do." In the afternoon, Catherine began her reorganization of the filing system. She'd asked Morrison for permission to improve the efficiency of document storage, and he'd agreed, partly curious, partly skeptical, mostly expecting her to fail spectacularly and prove Daniel's hiring decision foolish. What she created over 3 days was unlike anything the bank had seen before. Traditional filing systems organized alphabetically, straightforward, universally understood, but entirely dependent on the ability to read names and recognize letter order. Catherine's system organized by meaning, relationship, and visual pattern. She marked every document folder with symbols and colors according to a code only she initially understood. Circles for contracts, size indicating monetary value. Squares for correspondence, blue for incoming, red for outgoing, green for internal memos. Triangles for loan documents, point up for approved, point down for rejected, horizontal for pending. Diamonds for account statements. Stars for legal documents requiring attention. But the real genius was in the spatial organization. She didn't file alphabetically. She filed by conceptual relationship. All documents related to a specific customer or business were clustered together in physical space, regardless of document type. A merchant's loan application would be filed directly adjacent to their account statements, their correspondence with the bank, any contracts they'd signed, everything in one location organized by relationship rather than by arbitrary alphabetical order or rigid document type categories. Within each cluster, documents were organized chronologically by a color-coded system representing months. January was pale blue, February was deeper blue, March was green, and so on through the year. She couldn't read dates, but she could recognize month numbers and translate them into her color code instantly. What Morrison reported after 3 days was genuinely bizarre and somewhat unsettling. "She's completely reorganized our entire filing system," Morrison said, standing in Daniel's office looking baffled and perhaps slightly threatened. "Without reading a single document. Without understanding what most of them say. She's using shapes and colors and spatial positioning to categorize everything. It looks like absolute nonsense, like a child's art project or some kind of elaborate game. But sir, it actually works. I can find documents faster using her system than I could with our meticulous alphabetical filing. And I genuinely don't understand how that's possible." "Explain," Daniel said, setting down his pen to give Morrison his full attention. She marked all contracts with circle symbols. Different sizes of circles for different contract values. She somehow assessed value without reading the contents. All correspondence gets a square marker, blue squares for incoming letters, red for outgoing, green for internal bank memos. Loan documents get triangles, with the point direction indicating approval status, up for approved, down for rejected, sideways for pending review. It's like she's created a visual language for document types. Morrison paused, clearly struggling to articulate what he'd observed. But the positioning is what's truly strange, he continued. She's arranged everything on the shelves by relationship rather than alphabetically. Not ABC order but by conceptual connection. A business's loan application sits right next to their correspondence about that loan, which sits next to their account statements, which sits next to any contracts, everything connected to one entity clustered in physical space. It's organized by meaning and connection, not by alphabet or document type. And you say it works? Daniel asked. Faster than alphabetical, Morrison admitted with obvious reluctance. When you asked me to find the Henderson Mining Company contract yesterday, I went to the H section by reflex. Took me 4 minutes to locate it. This morning, I asked Catherine where it was. She said, Henderson Cluster, Orange section, apparently orange means September in her color system, and walked me directly to it. 15 seconds. Same result, dramatically faster process. Daniel leaned back in his chair, processing this information. She's created a semantic filing system. Organization by meaning rather than arbitrary alphabetical order. It's actually more efficient because related information is physically co-located. You don't have to remember whether you're looking for correspondence under H for Henderson or L for letters or S for September. You just go to the Henderson location and everything's there. Should I tell her to stop? Morrison asked. Return to standard alphabetical filing? No, Daniel said slowly, a small smile forming. Let her continue. She's proving something I'd never considered, that literacy-based systems aren't necessarily the most efficient systems. They're just the systems literate people designed. Someone experiencing the world differently designed a different system, and it might actually be superior for certain purposes. Over the following week, the entire bank staff gradually adapted to Catherine's visual filing system. Initially resistant, change always met resistance, especially change that challenged fundamental assumptions about how things should be done. They began to appreciate the efficiency. Documents that used to require 5 minutes of alphabetical searching could now be located in seconds by going directly to the relevant cluster and scanning for the appropriate color code. Catherine had proven something profound in her first week. Illiteracy wasn't incompetence. It was simply a different way of processing information. And sometimes different ways revealed solutions that traditional approaches missed entirely. But Daniel hadn't hired her to reorganize filing. He'd hired her to catch a thief. That shouldn't work, Daniel said. How do you find anything? That's what I said. But when I need a document, I can visualize where it fits in the relationship web, and it's exactly where my brain says it should be. It's faster than alphabetical because I'm not searching letter by letter, I'm going directly to the conceptual location. That's... Daniel paused. That's actually brilliant. She's organized information by meaning rather than arbitrary alphabetical order. She's created a knowledge map. Should I tell her to stop? Morrison asked. No, Daniel said slowly. Let her continue. And Morrison, tell me everything else she's doing. Over the next week, Catherine's behavior grew stranger and more methodical. She would arrive at the bank before anyone else, positioning herself in different corners of the main hall to observe from various angles. She'd sit perfectly still for hours, simply watching. Not working on files, not handling documents, just observing with those sharp, constantly moving eyes. She'd watch the morning routines, which clerks arrived early, which rushed in late. Who made eye contact with whom? Who avoided whom? She'd watch how each employee handled money, the confident ones who counted quickly, the nervous ones who counted twice, the careful ones who counted 3 times. She'd watch body language when customers entered, who straightened up, who slumped, who suddenly became very busy with paperwork. She took notes constantly in her incomprehensible symbol system. When Daniel tried to read her notes once, she explained, "This spiral means anxiety. The sharp angles are confidence. These dots are frequency markers, how often someone does something. This wavy line is inconsistency, behavior that changes day to day. I'm mapping behavioral patterns the way you'd map financial patterns." She followed different clerks during their routines, not hiding her observation, which made them deeply uncomfortable. One clerk, James Porter, complained directly to Daniel, "Sir, Miss Shaw is watching me like a hawk. Standing behind me while I work. It's unnerving. I can't concentrate." "What are you doing that requires concentration?" Catherine had asked Porter directly, her sharp eyes fixed on him. "Deposits and withdrawals are routine. Why does observation make routine work difficult?" Porter had no good answer. But Daniel noticed Porter started making more errors after that conversation, as if Catherine's attention had shaken his confidence. She asked questions that seemed random but weren't. Who processes the mining company deposits? Which clerk handles the Henderson family accounts? What time does the vault get locked each night? Who has keys to the document storage? Which employees work late alone? The staff found her deeply unnerving. She never made small talk. She rarely smiled. She watched everything with an intensity that made people feel exposed, vulnerable, seen. "She makes my skin crawl," one teller told Morrison. "The way she just stares. It's not natural." But Daniel was starting to understand what she was doing. Catherine wasn't just watching, she was reading the bank as a living system. She was seeing it the way he saw numbers, as patterns, relationships, flows that should follow certain rules. When something didn't fit the pattern, she noticed. When someone's behavior was inconsistent, she marked it. She was turning human behavior into data. On day 6, she approached Daniel with a request. "I need to see the employee work schedules for the past 6 months. Not the written schedules, the actual records of who was here when. Time cards, attendance logs, anything showing physical presence." Daniel provided the records. Catherine spent an entire day cross-referencing them with symbols in her notebook, creating some kind of map Daniel couldn't decipher. "Morrison works late every Wednesday," she said finally. "Alone. After you've left for the day. And your brother visits the bank every Wednesday evening, staying for exactly 45 minutes. They claim it's to review weekly reports together. But the reports are due Friday, not Wednesday. Why review them 2 days early?" "Thorough preparation," Daniel suggested, though he was already feeling uneasy. "Or opportunity," Catherine countered. "Wednesday evening. You're gone. The other clerks are gone. Just Morrison and your brother, alone with the ledgers and the vault, with time to make changes without observation. If I were stealing from this bank, Wednesday evening would be when I'd do it." Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You think my brother is involved?" "I think someone is teaching Morrison. Watch." She showed him her symbol maps, pointing to patterns he couldn't understand, but she explained clearly, "Morrison's anxiety is highest on Wednesday mornings, before your weekly review. But it drops Wednesday afternoons after your brother visits. Your brother's behavior changed 7 months ago, that's when the theft started. He used to visit randomly. Now it's always Wednesday evening. Always exactly 45 minutes. That's not casual. That's routine. That's pattern. That's purpose. This is speculation." "No," Catherine interrupted. "This is observation. Your ledgers show what was stolen. My observations show who and when. Combine them and you have proof. But we need to catch them in the act. Daniel looked at this woman who couldn't read a word but could read people with frightening accuracy. What do you need? Wednesday. You need to be gone but not gone. They need to think you're away while you're actually watching. Can you do that? The storage loft, Daniel said slowly. Above the main hall. There's a small window. I can see the entire banking floor from there. No one knows about it except me. Perfect, Catherine said. Next Wednesday. We watch. The following Wednesday morning, Daniel made his usual review of the week's accounts. He was loud about his upcoming trip to Denver, mentioned it to multiple employees, made sure everyone knew he'd be gone Wednesday afternoon and Thursday. He left at noon with obvious travel luggage. Then he circled around through the back alley and climbed to the storage loft through an external ladder most people had forgotten existed. Catherine was already there, having arrived separately. They positioned themselves at the small window overlooking the main floor. The bank closed at 4 p.m. By 4:30, all the clerks had left except Morrison, who claimed he was staying to finish paperwork. At 5 p.m., Thomas arrived. Daniel watched his brother enter through the front door, lock it behind him, and walk directly to Morrison at the head clerk's desk. They spoke in low tones, but the positioning allowed Daniel to read their lips, a skill he'd developed years ago to understand customers who mumbled or spoke with thick accents. How much this week? Thomas was asking. 300, Morrison replied. Small amounts from 6 different accounts. Spread out enough that he won't notice in his Friday audit. Good. Let me show you something new. Thomas opened a ledger and pointed to entries. See this notation? He checks the totals but not the dates. We can backdate deposits and forward date withdrawals. Creates lag time where money seems to be in 2 places at once. For one day, the same 300 exists in an account and in our pockets. Next week, we reverse it. He's too focused on totals matching to notice timing discrepancies. Morrison was taking notes. But what if he starts checking dates? He won't. I've worked with Daniel for 15 years. I know exactly how his mind works. He's brilliant with numbers but blind to human deception. He thinks everyone operates by the same rigid rules he does. His certainty in his system is what makes him vulnerable. He built a perfect mathematical cage and locked himself inside it. Thomas smiled, a cold, calculating smile Daniel had never seen on his brother's face before. Besides, Thomas continued, even if he suspects something, he'd never suspect me. I'm his brother. Family. He'd question anyone else before he'd question me. That trust is our greatest asset. Daniel felt something break inside his chest. Not just anger at the theft, that was bad enough. But the calculated betrayal, the cold manipulation of trust, the way Thomas spoke about Daniel's blindness and vulnerability with such contempt. They watched as Morrison and Thomas altered several ledger entries, changed dates, adjusted amounts, covering their tracks with practiced efficiency. They'd been doing this for months. 7 months, Catherine had calculated. 7 months of stealing, lying, exploiting Daniel's trust. After Thomas left and Morrison locked the bank for the night, Daniel and Catherine climbed down from the storage loft. Daniel's hands were shaking, not from fear but from rage barely contained. I'm sorry, Catherine said quietly. I know that was your brother. Don't apologize for showing me truth, Daniel said. His voice was cold, controlled, but she could hear the pain underneath. You saved my bank. The fact that you destroyed my illusions about my family in the process isn't your fault. It's his. The confrontation the next morning was brutal and swift. Daniel had spent the night preparing legal documents, contacting the sheriff, consulting with his lawyer. When Morrison arrived for work, 2 deputies were waiting. Morrison broke immediately under questioning, confessing everything, producing evidence, begging for leniency. When asked about Thomas's involvement, he showed no loyalty, named him as the architect, the teacher, the one who'd known exactly how to exploit Daniel's blind spots. Thomas arrived an hour later, expecting a normal business day. Instead, he walked into accusations, evidence, his clerk's testimony, and his brother's cold fury. He tried to deny. Then to minimize. Then to justify. You never gave me fair share of the profits. You controlled everything. I built this bank as much as you did, but you treated me like an employee. You were a partner, Daniel interrupted, his voice like ice. 50% ownership. 50% of all profits. If you wanted more money, you could have requested a larger draw. Instead, you chose to steal, to manipulate, to exploit my trust. Don't you dare pretend this is about unfair treatment. You're too rigid. Thomas shot back. Too perfect. Too demanding. Working with you is like working for a machine. You care more about your precious systems than about people. I cared about you, Daniel said quietly. I trusted you. I gave you half of everything I built. And you called that trust, blindness, and vulnerability. You mocked me for it while stealing from me. So yes, I'm rigid about honesty and loyalty. If that makes me a machine, then I'll be a machine. At least machines don't betray the people who depend on them. Thomas and Morrison were charged with embezzlement. Thomas sold his share of the bank to Daniel at a price well below market value. The only way to avoid criminal prosecution was to make full restitution and leave town permanently. Morrison went to prison. In the aftermath, Daniel sat alone in his office, looking at the bank he'd built, now tainted by betrayal. His perfect system had failed because he'd trusted the wrong people. His brother was gone. His reputation was damaged. Catherine knocked and entered. The staff is gossiping, she reported. About me. About why you kept an illiterate clerk. Some think I'm your mistress. Others think I was blackmailing you or your brother. A few think you've gone soft in the head. Let them talk, Daniel said wearily. They don't understand what you did. They can't see what I see. What do you see? I see someone who saved my bank when my education and experience failed. Someone who sees patterns I'm trained to miss. Someone who's brilliant in ways I was taught don't exist. Daniel looked at her directly. Catherine, for 20 years I believed intelligence only came in one form, educated, literate, credentialed. You've proven me completely wrong. You can't read a single word, but you read people, systems, patterns with genius I can't match. You're not illiterate and incompetent. You're different and brilliant. There's a distinction. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Most people don't see that distinction. Then most people are fools. And I've spent too much of my life caring what fools think. Daniel paused. I want to offer you a permanent position. Not as a clerk. As a partner in fraud detection and pattern analysis. I'll pay you what you're worth, not what society thinks an illiterate woman should earn. We'll build something new together, a bank that values both kinds of intelligence. Numbers and people. Ledgers and behavior. Your way and my way, combined. People will talk, Catherine warned. Let them. Daniel found himself smiling for the first time in days. I've just discovered that the person I trusted most was betraying me, and the person I almost dismissed as unqualified saved me. I'm done making decisions based on other people's expectations. I'm done trusting credentials over competence. If working with you damages my reputation, then my reputation was built on the wrong foundation. Over the following months, their partnership deepened into something neither had expected. Catherine taught Daniel to observe human behavior, to notice micro-expressions, behavioral patterns, timing discrepancies that his numbers-focused mind overlooked. Daniel taught Catherine the business, explaining financial concepts, helping her develop systems to work around her illiteracy, showing her how money and trust and reputation intertwined in banking. They worked late evenings together, Daniel reading aloud from contracts and correspondence that Catherine needed to understand, Catherine explaining the behavioral patterns she'd observed during the day while Daniel took notes in written words she'd never read. And somewhere in those long evenings, in the shared satisfaction of catching a forger trying to pass fake notes, in the quiet triumph of balancing a complex account together, in the discovery that partnership could exist between two different kinds of intelligence, somewhere in all of that, something deeper grew. Daniel realized he was falling in love on a Tuesday afternoon when Catherine caught a numerical error he'd missed. A single digit transposed in a ledger, 6 instead of 9, that would have cascaded into major discrepancies months later. "How did you see that?" he asked. "You can't read the words around it." "I can read numbers," Catherine said. "And more importantly, I can see pattern. This number," she pointed to the wrong 6, "it doesn't fit the sequence. The rhythm is wrong. Numbers have music, Mr. Frost. When you know the melody, a wrong note stands out." "Daniel," he said. "Call me Daniel." "And Catherine, that's extraordinary. You experience numbers as music. I experience them as relationships and ratios. We're both mathematical minds, but we process differently. Yours isn't worse or less, it's different. And that difference is valuable. Most people don't see it that way. Then most people are missing something profound." Daniel set down his pen. "Catherine, I need to tell you something. I've been trying to find the right moment, but there is no right moment for this. I'm falling in love with you. Actually, I think I already have fallen. Your mind, your different way of seeing, your refusal to let illiteracy limit what you accomplish, you're the most impressive person I've ever met." Catherine looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Frost, Daniel, I can't read. I'll never be able to read. Every book, every letter, every written document will always be meaningless symbols to me. Your world, this world of banking and contracts and written agreements, I'll always need help navigating it. I'll always be dependent on others for basic tasks society expects everyone to manage alone. And I," Daniel interrupted gently, "will always be blind to behavioral patterns you spot instantly. I'll always need your help reading people and social situations that confuse me. We're both dependent on others for things, Catherine. The only question is whether we want to depend on each other. People will judge you," Catherine warned. "A banker married to an illiterate woman. They'll say you're settling. That you could do better. That I'm taking advantage of your kindness. Let them say whatever they need to say to feel superior," Daniel replied. "I spent 38 years believing there was one kind of intelligence, one right way to be smart. You've shown me how wrong I was. How limited my thinking was. I don't want to go back to that certainty. I want to keep learning from your different way of seeing. And I want to build a life with you." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the desk, symbols only she understood. Finally, "I love you too. But Daniel, you need to understand what you're choosing. I'll never write you letters. I'll never read bedtime stories if we have children. I'll need help with things society considers simple and basic. People will pity you for having an illiterate wife. Then they'll be fools," Daniel said firmly. "And I've never particularly cared what fools think. Catherine, you caught a thief I'd missed for months using observation alone. You reorganized my entire filing system into something more efficient than what I'd designed. You're teaching me to see patterns in human behavior that make me better at my work. You're not limited. You're different. And your difference makes us both better." They married 3 months later in a small ceremony. Daniel made no attempt to hide Catherine's illiteracy, refused to pretend or apologize for it. When people asked how he could marry someone who couldn't read, he'd respond simply, "How could I not marry someone brilliant enough to solve a problem my education couldn't touch?" Catherine became not just his wife but his full partner in the bank. She couldn't be head clerk, too much of that role required reading correspondence and writing reports. But Daniel created a new position, pattern analyst and fraud detection specialist. Her job was to observe, to watch for behavioral anomalies that numerical audits missed, to spot discrepancies in human behavior that preceded financial discrepancies, to be the bank's early warning system for deception. And she was extraordinary at it. She developed a system for categorizing behavioral patterns. The hesitation pattern, when someone pauses too long before answering routine questions. When hands tremble slightly while handling certain documents. When eyes dart to exits before completing transactions. These microbehaviors, invisible to most observers, were giant red flags to Catherine. The avoidance pattern, employees who suddenly became very busy when certain customers entered. Clerks who'd swap positions to avoid handling specific accounts. People who take elaborate routes through the bank to avoid passing certain desks. Avoidance always meant something: guilt, fear, knowledge they shouldn't have. The consistency break: everyone had behavioral baselines. The clerk who always counted money twice but suddenly counted only once. The customer who always made morning deposits but switched to afternoons. Any break in established patterns meant something had changed, and change often meant deception. The observation response: how people reacted to being watched. Some got nervous, guilty. Some got annoyed, innocent but private. Some got hostile, hiding something bigger. Catherine could differentiate between normal discomfort and guilty panic. She couldn't write these systems down in traditional training manuals. But she could demonstrate, explain verbally, show examples. Daniel became her scribe, translating her observational wisdom into written protocols that other banks could study and adapt. Over 5 years, Catherine's methods caught 4 more attempted embezzlements before any money was stolen, identified 3 forgery schemes in their early stages, spotted 2 confidence men trying to establish false credentials, and prevented 1 elaborate fraud that would have cost the bank $15,000. Things that would have devastated Frost and Company. She stopped them before they started, all without reading a single word of documentary evidence. She read people instead. And people, it turned out, were harder to fake than paperwork. The banking community gradually took notice. Word spread about Frost and Company's remarkable fraud detection rate: less than 1% of transactions flagged, 0 losses to embezzlement since Catherine started, fastest problem identification in the territory. Other bankers wrote asking questions. How did Frost do it? What system was he using? What new auditing technique had he developed? Daniel always gave credit where it belonged: my wife Catherine. She observes behavioral patterns that trained auditors miss. She reads people the way I read numbers. We combined our different intelligences into one system. Some bankers scoffed. Behavioral observation. That wasn't real banking. That was superstition dressed up as methodology. But some were curious. A few asked if Catherine could train their staff. And so she began teaching, traveling to other banks with Daniel, demonstrating her observational techniques. She couldn't write curriculum, but she could show. Could explain what to watch for. Could help others develop their own pattern recognition. Daniel would transcribe everything into written training materials. Catherine would demonstrate. Together, they created the first behavioral fraud detection training program in the Western Territories. They hired 2 more pattern analysts at Frost and Company, people who thought differently, saw differently, processed information through non-traditional methods. One was dyslexic like Catherine, brilliant with spatial relationships but hopeless with written text. Another was a former professional gambler who'd learned to spot tells and deception across poker tables and could apply those skills to banking transactions. Daniel discovered something profound. People with learning differences often developed compensatory skills that made them extraordinary at specific tasks. The dyslexic young man who couldn't read fluently could spot document forgeries by seeing tiny inconsistencies in handwriting and spacing that literate people missed. The former gambler could read micro-expressions and body language with frightening accuracy. Catherine had been right, intelligence came in many forms. And the forms society dismissed as deficient were often just different, seeing the world through alternative frameworks that revealed truths that normal mind couldn't perceive. 5 years after Catherine caught the embezzlement, Frost & Company had expanded to 3 branches. Catherine managed fraud detection across all locations. They employed 5 pattern analysts, all with non-traditional cognitive styles. The bank's reputation shifted from most accurate to most innovative, known not just for financial stability but for pioneering new approaches to fraud prevention. Daniel published papers in banking journals about integrating behavioral analysis with traditional auditing. He gave speeches at regional banking conferences about the value of cognitive diversity in fraud detection. He became known as the banker who'd revolutionized the industry by hiring people others dismissed as unqualified. And Catherine, who'd spent her life being told she was limited, deficient, unemployable, became the most sought-after fraud detection consultant in 3 territories. Banks paid premium rates for her training sessions. Insurance companies reduced their rates for institutions using her methods. She remained illiterate. Still couldn't read a single word. Still needed Daniel or their assistants to handle anything involving written text. But she'd proven something fundamental: literacy wasn't intelligence. Reading ability wasn't the measure of a mind's worth. Some of the brightest people experienced the world through frameworks that didn't include traditional reading. And those alternative frameworks often revealed truths the literate mind couldn't see. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Daniel gave Catherine a gift, a leather-bound notebook filled with blank pages. "For your symbols," he said. "For mapping patterns only you can see. Your way of writing the world." Catherine ran her fingers over the fine leather, open to blank pages waiting for her unique language. Most people would give a book they could read together. "We're not most people," Daniel said. "We're a banker who's brilliant with numbers but struggles with human behavior, and a pattern analyst who's brilliant with people but can't read words. We're proof that intelligence comes in many forms and partnership means valuing differences rather than trying to eliminate them." Catherine smiled, one of her rare, genuine smiles that transformed her usually serious face. "We're also proof that love doesn't require perfect compatibility. Sometimes the best partnerships are between people who are completely different but complementary." "Different but complementary," Daniel repeated. "I like that. It describes us perfectly." That night, as Catherine filled her new notebook with symbols only she understood, and Daniel read aloud from a banking journal she'd never be able to read herself, they existed comfortably in the space they'd created, where literacy and illiteracy, traditional intelligence and alternative genius, written words and symbolic patterns all had equal value. They'd built a life that honored both their strengths. A marriage that celebrated differences. A business that proved cognitive diversity made systems stronger, not weaker. And when younger people asked Catherine for advice, people with dyslexia, dyscalculia, or other learning differences who'd been told they were limited, deficient, destined for menial work, she'd tell them, "Your brain works differently. Not worse. Different. Find what you're brilliant at. Develop it relentlessly. Build workarounds for what you can't do in partnerships with people whose strengths cover your gaps. Intelligence isn't one thing. It's 1,000 different ways of seeing truth. Find your way. Own it. And never let anyone tell you that your difference makes you less." 5 years. 2 embezzlement rings caught. One fraud syndicate exposed. 3 banks revolutionized. 5 pattern analysts trained. Dozens of speeches given. Hundreds of people taught that illiteracy didn't mean incompetence. And one marriage proving that the mind society dismissed as deficient could see truths the educated mind missed entirely. If this story of intelligence beyond literacy, of seeing value in different minds, of love that honors rather than tries to fix, moved you, please hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to remember that brilliance comes in many forms, that learning differences aren't deficiencies, and that sometimes the smartest person in the room is the one we've been trained to dismiss. Subscribe to Western Souls for more tales that challenge how we measure worth. And tell me in the comments, have you witnessed intelligence that didn't fit traditional measures? What happened? Where frontier justice meets the human heart.